Hello and welcome to this theory about FastAPI and intuition about FastAPI Python library to create APIs that is super simple and super fast as well. It's a very good tool in your toolbox, and we'll go through a little bit about what API is and then going into CRUD API, create, read, update, and delete. This is a theory one. We'll go into the slides and we'll go in there directly. Here we are in the slides. FastAPI, a Python library to create APIs really simple and fast. Let's take a look into this. We start talking about Web API. Web API is a layer or an interface to facilitate communication between front end and back end. And then we're talking about REST API. And in Web APIs, we have this. For example, we have backend. And then in the backend, we could have database, we could have data processing, we could have ML models if we're working with Python and working a lot with machine learning, and we could serve ML models, for example. And then you have a front end. The front end could have a lot of buttons, filters, etc., and maybe a search button. And then afterwards, you want to display the data somehow. You want to display things from the backend in the front end, that the user can see this beautiful dashboard and understand the data, etc. This could be done either in many cases, many people create, for example, Streamlit application where you connect directly to your backend, but then your backend and frontend is quite tightly coupled. And what you want is to, when you're getting more and more bigger application, want to be more scalable, you want to decouple things so that the backend and the frontend lives by itself, and then there's a layer in between in order to facilitate the communication. And this is the API layer, that you're not talking directly to the backend. Instead, you're talking to this API layer, and it will talk to the backend, and it will fetch the data that you want. It will give the different processing that you want based on what you're sending back and forth. And what you do, for example, if you're in Python, you want to send the data through an API, you do request.get, you do request.post, and you can post data, you can send data, get data from the backend, and then you can display it in your front-end application. That is how it works in getting some intuition behind this. You have a layer in between. The idea is that you can, for example, if you create a front end in Streamlit first, then maybe you want to change it. You want to discard Streamlit and use TypePy instead. That also works. You could remove TypePy. You could work with the JavaScript front end directly. For example, you could work with React. You could work with Solid.js. There's a lot of things that you can do. You can change the front end, and you can still keep the backend as Python, where you have your machine learning models, etc. So that works. And then we'll talk about CRUD operations. This is a simple pattern for building data APIs. And what is CRUD? We have create, read, update, and delete. These are some basic fundamental operations that can be made through the API. Create in FastAPI is called post. And it adds new data that you can post through the API, and then in the backend it will create the data. And then you have get request, which does read operation, and it gets the data from the backend through the API into your front-end application. Or you don't need to have a front-end actually. You could have other things that this API. It doesn't have to be front-end directly. Then you have update, which is put in the FastAPI, and it's changing existing data point. And delete is called delete as well, and this removes the data point. This is CRUD. It's a simple pattern for building data APIs, and we'll move on to FastAPI to have a quick glance how it looks. This is a script called API. We have created this one. It doesn't have to be called API. I just called it this, but you can call it whatever you want. Then you start with importing from FastAPI, and app equals FastAPI. This creates the FastAPI application, and then you use this app and decorate your different functions to create the different endpoints. App means that this /books becomes the get endpoint. You get the data with this endpoint. This means that we create a API application, and this one is creating an endpoint /books. And this returns the data returned at this endpoint. It means that you will return this books object, whatever it contains, and it will send back to this URL. The URL that you're visiting is this one. you're visiting localhost/books. And you could deploy it, and then you have that URL and then /books, and then you will get the data. In terminal, you run this command, uvicorn api:/app-reload. And the reload makes it that if you change the code, you don't need to run the code again. Instead, it will reload directly in the browser when you're opening it. And you need to navigate to this page. This is first is localhost 127.0.0.1, and then :8000. 8000 is the port in your browser. And then to see the data, to go into this endpoint, you need to do this localhost and /books to see the data, and then you will get the data back in JSON format. If you had the data in, for example, Pydantic model, FastAPI will turn it into JSON data, because it's the JSON data that is sent back and forth as for communication. We're sending JSON back and forth. In order to create data, we use post request. We looked into get request before. Now is post request is here. You have this endpoint /books and then /create book. And then you have this .post. It's the post that makes it into post request that creates data, right? Here you have, this makes this endpoint into a post request, and you have the book here is a Pydantic model in this case, so that you have the validation, but it doesn't need to be a Pydantic model, but it could be. And here it's good to return the object that is posted. You return the object. And what you do here is that the new book, you do book.modelValidate. So you validate based on the schema of the book object, which is a Pydantic model, and then you append the book into this books. This is a books object that contains a lot of books, or a list that contains a lot of book objects. And the request body that you send is a JSON object that could look like this. You have here a JSON body that is containing different fields, and you send this using post request. And for doing that, if you're in Python, for example, you do request.post, and then you also send in the header as that it should be application/JSON, that it's the JSON that you send in. Yes. And then you have update, which is done by using put request. And here you have app.put, and makes this endpoint into a put request, and it's good to return the object that is put as well. And the request body is similar as before. It's still a JSON. And what it does here is that you see you have updated book as a JSON object, and then you go through this and you find the book.id, and it should be the same as the updated book.id that you see, okay, ID 11, and if there is an ID 11 already, then we can update that book. Yes. Here we have a delete request is the final one of the CRUD operations, and here is and then you use something called a path parameter. This is a path parameter. So value in endpoint used in the function. This ID is used here in the delete book. Delete book if ID in path parameter matches book ID. You check that they are the same, and then you delete that particular book. So, and for example, the endpoint would be like this, /book/delete book/5 means that we will delete the fifth element, the ID with 5 in this list. Delete book with ID 5. And then now we're talking about the CRUD operations, and we will talk about path parameters as well. In FastAPI, there's also something called the query parameters. We'll look into that. Query parameter for key value pairs in the URL. This is some code here for get request. And here you have /book/, and then you have start year and author as two different parameters. And these parameters, we have done the query here in order to make some validation on it. Here you have query parameter with validation and description. The validation here is that default is 9050, and then we have greater than 1500, less than current year +1. And then you have filters booked that are newer than this year. And this is the description. This description will end up in your Swagger UI later. I'll show you what Swagger is, the documentation. And you have the author as well. And then this is the code for filtering the books based on these key value pairs that you send in. Filters data to be returned based on query parameters. And how it looks like in the endpoint is that you have slash books slash, and then you have question mark, and then afterwards you put in your parameters, which is here start year equals 1999. You put in the start year will be 1999, and author is an percentage 20 means a space in the URL. That is how it works. That the start year is 1999 and author is Kokshen Yang, and it will go into this function here, this filter books function, and then we will use these two. We have start year here and we have the author here in order to filter the books, right? This was the query parameter. We have parameters and path parameters. And then finally we'll talk about some documentation, and the documentation you have something called Swagger UI to interact with your API. And this is super neat in FastAPI that you have this, because with this you don't need to have outside tools such as Postman, for example. You can directly interact with your API in the web. You go into /docs, and inside there it looks like this. You have this Swagger UI which shows all the endpoints that you have. And here you can click on one and you can try out the endpoint, and you can execute it, and you can see which data is sent back, etc., and how it looks like. In this video, we have gone through the very basics of FastAPI and API in Python, and we've gone through some theory and intuition on how API layer works between front-end and back-end, and then we took a look into CRUD API, create, read, update, and delete, and we looked into the syntax of how it worked, like how to navigate to different endpoints, etc., and how to do create, read, update, and delete, and then we finally looked into some path parameters and query parameters, and also looked into Swagger UI for interactive documentation for your API. This is really interesting, and if you want to learn more, go into the coding video where I actually create this API. I will leave that in the description, and see you in the next video. Bye!